Institute of Higher Education, and I'd like to welcome everybody. You can't hear me? I'd like to welcome everybody to the 5th Annual Battle of New Orleans Historical Symposium, Day 2. Last night was a good one. We have 11 lectures scheduled for tomorrow, the next day, Friday and Saturday at the St. Bernard Government Center. And so those are going to be great. We also have this year for the first time this Battle of New Orleans Historical Tour leaving on Friday and Saturday. If any of that's of interest, which I hope it is, we'll have information in the back, or I can get you some information. So we hope you continue to enjoy all of this. But tonight we have a very special night. We have our traditional symposium, lots of lectures on 2 days. But this year, for the first time, we added what we call our appetizer lecture. We wanted to spread, not from the main part, but kind of spread out to very historical places to deal with very important local historical topics. So tonight, very appropriately, at the Los Islenos Museum Complex, our lecture tonight will be Los Islenos in the Battle of New Orleans. Very important thing. Our speaker tonight, everybody knows well, I'm sure, William DeMerity Island has been a very important historical figure in St. Bernard Parish for a long time. St. Bernard Parish historian, director of this complex. In the Nunez History Lecture Series in the Battle of New Orleans Historical Symposium, one of our most frequent lectures. And in fact, this year played an integral part in the organization of the symposium. So let's get right to the good stuff. I'd like to introduce Bill Hyland.
Thank you so much, Curtis, and it's great to have everyone here. So anyway, I want to begin, of course, by recognizing when she comes out, the president of Los Islenos Society, Rhonda Rodriguez Hanna, who is Junior Rodriguez's daughter, and she began her support of the Islenos Society at the age of 5 in 1978, when we had a mass here, when we had a mass at St. Louis Cathedral to commemorate the bicentennial of the arrival of the Islenos. And her offering to the altar was a crab and a shrimp. and I have to tell you that she's just done great things, and the society is so thrilled to have all of you here tonight, and for you to be able to sample wine from Spain and cheese from Spain, and to be here and be part of this wonderful facility. We also have the other members of our board of directors here. We have one of our past presidents, Wimpy Serenade, and his lovely wife, Doris, and they come every week to docent here, and so we're very much in their debt, and we just think the world of them. Also, you know, we've had many great good friends, and we have tonight Dorothy Benj, whose mother, Louise Molero O'Toole, and her aunt, Mabel Molero Portroy, donated this property to us so that we could have an Isleno museum and an Isleno historic village and a multi-purpose building where we are tonight. So, Dot, thank you so much for being here, and it's an honor to have you. And then, of course, the family of our first parish historian, Frank Fernandez, is represented again here tonight in the person of the distinguished Anthony A. Fernandez, who was secretary of the police jury, chief deputy of St. Bernard Parish Sheriff's Office, and attorney. A very accomplished man, and as you saw last night, a wonderful historian. So, very briefly, let me tell you about where you are. This is Los Islenos Museum Complex, and it consists of 22 acres and 9 structures. The first of the buildings was acquired by St. Bernard Parish government from the Ducrot family. And of course you think, well, you know, that's a French family. And the name is French. And it was donated to us by Rosa Ducrot Tennant in memory of her father, Louis-Alfred Ducrot. He was a medical doctor, alumnus of Tulane University, nationally recognized as a pioneer in public health. And even though he had the name Ducrot, he was 3/4 Isleno Spanish, and very proud of it. And this donation came about as a result of the work of Frank Fernandez, who was our first parish historian. And then, of course, Frank, who was ever persuasive, when the group went to the Canary Islands in 1977, for the first time since the arrival of our ancestors here 200 years ago, Dot's mother was on the plane. And wouldn't you know that fortune had it that Frank Fernandez was seated next to Louise Bolero O'Toole. So after hours of plane flight with Frank, she saw the wisdom of donating this place. And it was easy for her to do that because she was such a brilliant lady. She was bilingual. She was an accomplished businesswoman and a dear friend of mine. And so it was just a natural fit that she would do that. And then, of course, we've had our ups and downs here. Parish government owns this facility. And then for many years, we had a cooperative agreement with the National Park Service. After Newt Gingrich in the mid-90s, it was determined that the Park Service didn't have the funds really to do much here anymore. So they left us. And they left us with Islenos Museum, a standing ruin, and Ducro Museum, which the parish had. So Dot Benge, Frank Fernandez, Joan Phillips, Junior Rodriguez, they all said, what are we going to do? So thank goodness we had a lot of good leadership. And by 2000, the Park Service pulled out in January 96. By 2000, this building was on its way to being built. We moved 2 of the historic structures here, and we were well on our way. Then we had the catastrophe of Katrina. The original replica building that stood here was swept off its piers and had to be rebuilt. The original Islenos Museum was crushed by an 80-foot water oak. The Estopanol House, which is the next building over, lost its roof. So you see this facility, $3.1 million FEMA dollars later. And again, it represented a lot of hard work on the part of parish government, the society. Dot Benge did a great job of helping to guide the rebuilding, and of course I worked very assiduously on all that. So $3.1 million FEMA dollars later, and about 700,000 Islenos donated dollars later, here you have this. So it's really great to have you here. And then before I begin the historic tour, or historic lecture, I want to call attention to the wonderful Los Islenos Fiesta, which we will have March 4th and 5th. Rhonda is already working herself to death, figuring out what she's going to cook, how she's going to cook it. We have a great group of ladies and gentlemen coming together to cook and make food. We'll have wonderful wine donated by John Besh. We'll have we have a chef coming, it would appear, from La Gomera. And it also seems that we also have from that same island, La Gomera, a folkloric singing and dancing troupe, a musical troupe of about 25 people. So we'll have a full-blown fiesta this year, and we're very much looking forward to it. So I've given this lecture in the past, Los Islenos in the Battle of New Orleans. And so we're going to talk about their role in the battle. But first, as it were, we need to set the table. And we need to see what was the Louisiana that the Islenos came to, briefly, and also what it was that they left behind. So, of course, Louisiana was colonized by the French. And I have many ancestors who were part of that colonization effort. And I'm very proud of that ancestry. However, I have to say that the French period here, that first period of French colonization, was one marked by great apathy. And this apathy was in many respects caused by the fact that France thought that she was the greatest power in the Western world, and France had this wonderful way of promoting herself, as she still does. And so Louisiana, in her scheme of things, was very non-productive. You know, when she looked at her colonies, the colonies were for the benefit of the glory, the grandeur de la France. And of course, in North America and in the Caribbean, Saint-Domingue, we have Saint-Domingue here tonight. Saint-Domingue was her great jewel, producing so much wealth to sustain the prestige and the image of France through the production of coffee and sugar and the slave society that was there. When France finally established a dominion here, it was very sparsely populated. There were very few people here. And as a matter of fact, in the 1740s, amazingly enough, the only specie, the only currency in Louisiana very often was Spanish from Mexico. As a matter of fact, as you go back and you research, you even see that there were times that the French in Louisiana would have starved in those earliest days had not the Spaniards sent flour and other provisions. And of course, it behooved the Spaniards to do that because their traditional age-old enemy was Great Britain. And the last thing that Spain wanted was an expanding presence of Great Britain in the Gulf of Mexico region. So, there were, when we became Spanish, 13,000 plus colonists, European colonists, because you know there were more than French here, free black people and slaves. The defenses of Louisiana were in an utterly deplorable condition. Louisiana was at that point virtually defenseless. Louis Billard de Kellerec, or as we say, Kellerec, who was one of the last French governors, was a miracle worker. He had been in the French Navy, and he was a naval officer. He was very gritty, and with nothing, he was able to forge and maintain alliances with the Choctaws and other Native Americans. Without those alliances, we may not have survived. Then, of course, began the French and Indian War of the 7 Years' War. And at that point, there was a pacte de famille between the ruling families of France and Spain. Two great-grandsons of Louis XIV sat on the thrones of Spain and France. So, Spain entered the war supporting the greatness of France and trying to repress the presence of Great Britain. Of course, the French lost the war. The French lost Nouvelle-France, which is today Quebec. The Spanish lost Florida. As a dear friend of mine used to say, the diplomats in Europe started playing colonial poker. So all of these colonies started changing hands. And then, by the treaties of Paris and Fontainebleau in the early 1760s, Louisiana was given to France, was given to Spain and to Great Britain. And so everything west of the Mississippi River, with the exception of the Ile d'Orléans, or the Isle of Orleans, was ceded to Spain. Everything east of the Mississippi River went to Great Britain. And of course, the British were very accomplished. You know, they were rapidly becoming the great Western power. And so they wasted no time sending colonists to what had previously been Louisiana. They were very interested, for instance, in Natchez, and very interested in what would become West Florida. And they offered huge grants of thousands of arpents in order to attract East Coast colonists to this virtually uninhabited land. Well, when When Spain finally took possession of Louisiana in 1766, she sent a brilliant scholar. His name was Antonio de Ulloa. He was a scientist. He was esoteric. He was everything that the earthly Louisianians were not. And suffice it to say that within a couple of years, he had been so turned around by the Louisiana French politicians who were here, all of whom belonged basically to a party of political interest rooted in the Lemoine Bienville family, that he failed. And as a matter of fact, there was, in 1768, a revolution, as they called it. Ulloa chose to call it an insurrection, a riot. And he said that it was caused by the fact that he had advised the colonists that they could bring their wine through Saint-Domingue to Louisiana, but that they felt that was too much effort. And he advised that he was doing that. They wanted to have their wine from Bordeaux come directly to Louisiana. And he said that such was the measure of these feeble-minded people that they were running through the streets of New Orleans shouting, "Death to Catalan poison," a reference to some of the wine that you've been drinking tonight. So you see how poisonous it is. So in any event, he was set adrift in the river, and then Charles III, who was the greatest Bourbon king of Spain, sent his most accomplished military figure here. He had a Spanish name. His Spanish name was Alejandro O'Reilly, otherwise known as Alexander O'Reilly. And he was a great military leader. He came and he felt that he had no choice other than to put to death the leaders of this insurrection. And then after that, he proceeded to restructure Louisiana. The man had a great genius and a great vision. And he codified the laws of Louisiana, and those laws still remain somewhat in effect in Louisiana. Though, of course, there are those who say that they're French, but since I belong to the Pascal faction, I say that it's Spanish. But in any event, brilliant man. He saw also that the fortification system needed to be enhanced, and one of the first things he said was, 13,000 people show up in our census. We have to have more people to save Louisiana, because remember, Louisiana extended from the Gulf to what is today Canada. Right. So you're looking at an immense piece of property. So, one of the things too that Alejandro O'Reilly also noted was that the British were here and that they were recording, documenting all of the settlements and all of the facilities of Louisiana. And on the table there, I have a facsimile copy of the present state of European settlements on the Mississippi by Captain Philip Pittman in 1770. And you can see the maps that he drew in 1770 from the mouth of the river all the way above St. Louis, including a detailed map of the city of New Orleans showing where everything was, including the powder magazines. So the British were well aware that we were here. Now, coming with O'Reilly in 1769 was a fascinating man. He was from Alicante, which is in Valencia, and as a matter of fact, some of our Spaniards who came here to Louisiana and live here with us in St. Bernard today are Valencianos. But in any event, Francisco Bolívar came with O'Reilly. He served many times as acting governor of Louisiana. He was the face of the government of Louisiana in so many ways. And he wrote a memoria in 1776, which he addressed to the Spanish court. And he called for the immediate colonization of Louisiana by Spaniards and those others in opposition to the interest of Great Britain. Quote, Spain must populate Louisiana or prepare to lose this vast land and the unknown potential of the Mississippi Valley. See, the man was a visionary. The British had a stranglehold on the economy of Louisiana. It was just a terrible time. Spain didn't know what to do or how to phase the British out without causing the economy of Louisiana to collapse. So there were many different problems facing Spain, and what Spain was most interested in was developing Louisiana as a barrier to British colonial expansion and causing the residents of Louisiana to accept the Spanish presence and to become ultimately Spaniards. So, Bulini founded Nueva Iberia, New Iberia, in 1779 along the banks of Bayou Teche, mostly with colonists from Malaga. And then, of course, between 1778 and 1783, almost 3,000 colonists were recruited. They didn't all come, but almost 3,000 were recruited to come to Louisiana. Almost 2,000 Acadians came to Louisiana, all at the expense of the Spanish crown and all within a 10-year period. So when you're looking at a population of 13,000, and then you're looking at 5,000 destined to come here, that in and of itself was a great addition to our population. Now, the conditions in the Canary Islands were very poor at that time. One must remember that the islands are in the Atlantic Ocean. They're 80 miles off Morocco, about 150 miles from the Sahara Desert. They're volcanic in origin. They're very desert-like, particularly the ones closest to the African continent. And very frequently, the population would grow to such an extent that the islands could not support that population. And this had happened in the 1760s. There had been a series of epidemics. There was a long-lasting drought, so that the conditions there were very, very primitive. And then, of course, you know, they were mostly farmers, almost all farmers, and they were very accomplished farmers. They were largely illiterate. They had a very, very meager diet. They lived in stone houses with palm roofs, and many of them without doors and windows and dirt floors. So theirs was not an easy life. And you can imagine coming here to Louisiana, it was vastly different. And in many ways, it was a great improvement for them. Now, the tradition of Canary Islanders as forming a colonization vanguard is absolutely famous. As a matter of fact, throughout the Spanish Americas, generally, whenever someone says Isleño, Islander, they think of Islenos Canarios, Canary Islanders. So many Canary Islanders came here. One of the great jokes in the Canaries has been that Venezuela is the 8th Canary Island because so many Canarios have settled there. Bolivar and Miranda both trace their ancestries to the Canary Islands. Cuba, another place with a tremendous heritage of Canary Islanders. Jose Marti is the liberator, or was the liberator of Cuba. As a matter of fact, he lived in New Orleans and knew St. Bernard rather well. His mother was born in Tenerife. And then, of course, San Antonio, Texas was founded by Canarios, principally from Lanzarote, in 1731. So there are many precedents for the Canary Islanders coming here. Governor Bernardo de Galvez was the governor of Louisiana when the Canarians arrived. And he settled them in 4 locations along waterways which connected the Gulf of Mexico to the Mississippi River. The first of the settlements was Galvez Town, and it was at the confluence of the Emite River and Bayou Montchac. Bayou Montchac actually led, particularly in flood stage, to the Mississippi River. And then the Emite River ultimately connected to Lake Maurepas. So that became an international outpost because just across that confluence was British West Florida. So, and that was the first of the settlements. The others followed, that was in 1778. In 1779, we had the other settlements established, which were Barataria, which is today part of the Jean Lafitte Park, along the shores of Bayou des Familles, Bayou of the Families, because of the Canary Island families. Valenzuela, named for Galvez's aunt, and that was along the shores of Bayou La Fourche, near modern-day Donaldsonville. And then, of course, the ultimate settlement in 1779 was La Concepcion, which by 1784 was renamed San Bernardo. That's where we are today. And of all the settlements, it became most successful, primarily because of its proximity to New Orleans, and then it also became most successful in retaining its cultural identity, because as some of the ladies were telling me today, it was quite something for them to get down here. Well, you know, St. Bernard 250 years ago was a destination as well. You know, you don't go through St. Bernard to get somewhere. This is where you have to be coming. So that promoted a sort of isolation, which enhanced and which caused the preservation of our cultural identity. So the Canary Islanders were recruited in the Canaries. They all were obligated to serve in the Regimiento de Louisiana. Land grants were awarded in all of the settlements, except at Galveztown, which was the only settlement that was actually a town laid out in a grid. And then housing was provided by the Spanish government. I'm delighted to tell you that here on these grounds, we have one of the original houses, probably the only one surviving, built for the Estopanol family. There were also rations of supplies, livestock, a monthly salary, a stipend, agricultural tools, and all other things that were necessary to establish them here. So that it was a very costly program, and it was constantly monitored by the Spanish government, and particularly by the treasurer of Louisiana, who was Juan Buenaventura Morales. So, and it's very interesting to read his dispatches to the commandant saying that they were spending too much money on the Islenos. And then the commandant who was here, Pierre-Philippe de Marigny, wrote back to him and told him that he was well pleased with the progress of the people here, and that the money was well spent, and that he should consult with Governor Galvez if he had any additional questions. So he was one of the few people who ever called Morales down. Eventually, Spain entered the American Revolution, again through the Pacte de Famille of the Bourbon families, as an ally of Spain. As an ally of France. And this resulted here in Louisiana in the Galvez expedition. And I know we have ladies here and gentlemen here today who are descendants of people who fought in the Galvez expedition. And of course, the first campaign was from Montchac and Baton Rouge in 1779. That resulted in the capitulation of Natchez as well. Then Mobile in 1780 and Pensacola in 1781. Islenos did fight under the command of Governor Galvez, though he freed many of them from the commitment to fight because food was very much a problem here, and they were all expert farmers. So they could render as much service raising crops to feed the colony as they could fight. And that's exactly what many of them did. Here in St. Bernard Parish, Sebastián González was from the mainland of Spain, next to Portugal, in a place called Aracena. He was in the Galvez expedition. He married a daughter of Francisco González Carbo, who lived in Valenzuela. And it's really interesting as I look around the room here, and many of us are descendants of those two people. And I would think that González Carbo family, which Paul has written about, has really descendants all over southeast and southwest Louisiana. It's a huge family. But those were some of the people who fought in the Galvez expedition. San Bernardo continued to evolve. There were settlements established along Bayou Terrebonne. I don't know, for those of you who are not from here, if you realize that the ditch on the side of the road is really not a ditch. 3,000 years ago, that was the main channel of the Mississippi River. That's Bayou Terrebonne. And that's why the Islenos were settled here, because it connected the Mississippi River to lakes and to waterways that led to the Gulf of Mexico. So strategically, it was very important. And so, of course, the Islenos became expert farmers. They brought with them the tradition of domesticating cattle and using those cattle to cultivate the fields and even to carry the families and the crops from the farms here to the French market. And then, of course, there was another person who came with the Canary Islanders. He was not a Canary Island descendant, but he had met them when many of them were marooned, if you will, in Cuba, because many of the boats were not able to come to Louisiana when they were originally destined to come here because of the American Revolution. So they stopped in Cuba. And while they were there, Manuel Solis met them, and he came to Louisiana. And according to Pierre Clément de Laussac, who was the French prefect sent to govern Louisiana for Napoleon, according to Laussac, he says that it was Solis and his partner Mendes who introduced the cultivation of sugarcane to Bayou Terrebonne in an effort to make rum, and that they also granulated sugar, but they ran out of money to complete the process, perfect the process of granulating sugar. So, of course, ultimately it was Barré who did that. But it's very interesting to think that that originated here in St. Bernard in the Canary Island settlement. And so, and there are many other things that happened there too. In 1792, the Volunteers of the Mississippi was a regiment established, and it was a militia regiment, and the commandant or the captain of it was Pierre-Philippe de Marillier, and its membership was comprised of the Canary Islanders from St. Bernard and the people living on the east and west banks of Plaquemine Parish in what was called the Cotombin. And that group was later reconstituted as the 3rd Regiment of Louisiana Militia, and it fought in the Battle of New Orleans. In 1796, a great alarm was generated in Spanish administrative circles upon receipt of military intelligence by Spain that the Ministry of War in Great Britain proposed an invasion of Louisiana with between 2,000 and 3,000 men carried in shallow draft cannon launches by way of Lakes Maurepas, Pontchartrain, and Bourne. Governor Carondelet received advisories that Pensacola was virtually defenseless, weaker than it was when the Spaniards captured it from the British in 1781. But once again, the Spaniards did what they had to make things work, and they did try to reinforce and repair many of these fortifications. Also in 1795 was the Treaty of San Lorenzo, which fixed the boundary of West Florida at the 31st degree of north latitude, the modern east-west boundary between Louisiana and Mississippi. And then, of course, this also resulted in the establishment of the Felicianos, wherein the Spanish government, in an effort to encourage Anglo-speaking people, English-speaking Anglo-Americans, to come to Spanish Louisiana and to West Florida, they offered them land grants, and then, of course, they wanted to convert them to Catholicism. So this is why we find at that point so many Irish priests like Father Juan Brady, or Patricio Walsh, or Patricio Mannion. I can go on and on. Father Juan Brady was here in St. Bernard. Then, of course, things were happening, as always, in Europe. There was always that game of colonial poker. Manuel Godoy was the favorite of Charles IV and Maria Luisa, the King and Queen of Spain. And he was very inept, very handsome. He made the Spanish court the scandal of Europe. He had seduced the Queen of Spain, hunted daily with the King of Spain, and the King of Spain was oblivious to what was going on. And of course, Manuel Godoy, the Prince of Peace, thought that he was positively brilliant because, after all, he had co-opted the Spanish royal family, so naturally he could outwit Napoleon Bonaparte. Well, needless to say, that did not happen. And as a matter of fact, Napoleon Bonaparte thought that he was a simple idiot, and as events proved themselves, he was right. And one of the things that happened was the Treaty of San Ildefonso, which was signed in one of the summer palaces of the Spanish royal family. It's La Granja. It's absolutely beautiful. And in that treaty, Louisiana was retroceded to France in recompense for a kingdom, which had been the Duchy of Parma, being restored to the Spanish Bourbon family. And then in the treaty, there was the codicil that France would not consider relinquishing Louisiana again until she had first offered it to France, to Spain rather. So in any event, that did not happen. And in 1803, Napoleon decided that he would sell Louisiana to the United States. He was only really interested in Louisiana because he wanted to establish an empire here. And without Saint-Domingue, and of course the loss of his vast army in Saint-Domingue to yellow fever and other disease, Louisiana, in his scheme of things, became useless or worthless. So he sold us to the United States, and again, we changed our national identity. Can you imagine, in 1803, there were people living in Louisiana who had had 4 national identities. And can you imagine what a crisis of faith that tended to cause amongst our people? And it's important to remember that. So, there were many Louisianians, particularly young Louisianians, who were influenced by men like Daniel Clark, who was a very charismatic Irishman, very young man. He had been very successful, as were many of the Irish, throughout the Spanish Empire as a business person. And he was determined that Louisiana should become American. And he openly promoted it with everyone and anyone he could. And there were others who felt that way. Evan Jones, for instance, who left New York, came to Louisiana, was commandant at Donaldsonville. His family, of course, is very well known in New Orleans today. Harry McCall was one of his descendants, the former King of Carnival. Evan Jones, one of the founders of Christ Church Cathedral in New Orleans, he was another person very well thought of by the Spaniards, fought in the Galvez expedition, but determined that we should become American when the opportunity presented itself. So, these people successfully floated this optimistic view of things, which began to be cautiously accepted as we became American, though there were hiccups. And for instance, here in St. Bernard, poor Governor Claiborne, the territorial governor, he made the mistake of appointing Antonio Mendes as the first parish judge of St. Bernard. And the next thing that Governor Claiborne knew, Judge Mendes and Father Juan Brady were fomenting a revolution here at Terre-Haute with the Islenos. But that was quickly put down, and after a while, you know, the Islenos settled in once again to being farmers and pursuing their existence here in Louisiana. Sugar, of course, in the early 1800s and in the late 1700s began to become very important here at Bayou Terre-Haute in what is today the eastern St. Bernard Parish. Louisiana was admitted to statehood in 1812. The British appeared in Lake Borgne in December of 1814, as we heard last night. Most Islenos were taken prisoner with the 3rd Regiment of Louisiana Militia during the December 23rd, 1814 night battle. Militia members taken prisoner included Sergeant Bartolome Molero, and we have descendants of his here, Roque Acosta, Felix Gonzalez, and Felipe Gonzalez was the son of Sebastian Gonzalez, who fought in the American Revolution. And he was the grandson of Francisco Gonzalez Cargo, who was from Tenerife, who also fought in the Galvez expedition. Joseph Cercas and many others. As a matter of fact, most of the Isleno men and men from Plaquemine were kept prisoner through most of January 1815, and they were unable to return to their farms in St. Bernard and Plaquemine. As a matter of fact, Jackson kept the militia mustered well into 1815. And he did that because, of course, you know, no computer, no television. Who was to know that the British wouldn't come back? And so the Islenos were unable to return to their farms and rebuild and recover their losses. So it was really a terrible thing. You know, the British took cattle, they took grain, they took outbuildings, they took everything that they needed to supply themselves while they were here. And they did offer to pay money for what they took, but it was considered not very adequate compensation. Rita Gonzalez Cargo, who was Felix Gonzalez's mother, absolutely, most certainly, lost her mind. She went insane with grief over what happened. She was born in Tenerife, and she spent the last years of her life in terrible condition. And it was so terrible that Bishop Dubourg wrote to Jackson, begging Jackson to release the farmers so that they could return to their farms. But he was concerned about the British, and what happened. And what happened is this, in a nutshell. The Islenos, many of them, sold their grants to the sugar planters. And the sugar planters consolidated these grants into large estates. And by the 1830s, St. Bernard was one of the richest and most productive sugar planting areas in the state of Louisiana. But the Islenos worked on the sugar plantations. Then there were those Islenos, such as the ones who were here, who retained ownership of their land grants into the 20th century. And as a matter of fact, we have people living in St. Bernard Village and in Toca Village here in this vicinity who are living on land grants their ancestors received from the Spanish government. So not every Isleno sold his land grant. After the Civil War, the Islenos who had sold to the sugar planters and worked on the plantations found that the plantation economy was destroyed, and they had no choice other than to retreat to the easternmost reaches of the parish, where they became subsistence livers. They became moss gatherers, professional hunters, trappers, commercial fishermen. For instance, we have Corby Acosta back here. And Corby has an ancestor of Roque Acosta who fought in the battle. But then on his mother's side, he descends from Juan Rubert, who came from Malgrete in Catalonia. And there are newspaper accounts that claim in the 1880s that it was Juan Malgrete, Roberts, who founded the commercial fishing industry in Louisiana. And St. Bernard, rather, and I have every reason to believe it. The Battle of New Orleans is the first recorded cataclysmic happening to permanently reshape the face of St. Bernard Parish. St. Bernard was never what it was before the Battle of New Orleans, just as we will never be what we were before Katrina. Isleno traders. It has been erroneously asserted that the Islenos were British spies and traitors to the United States. Arsène Lacarrière Latour names those lake-born fishermen who aided the British. The master fishermen were someone named Marin. I have no idea who that was. Old Luis, have no idea who that was. Francisco and Gabriela, no idea who they were. Then the hireling fishermen were Antonio el Italiano, and I have to say that many of us in this room descend from him. El Campechano, that's a person from Campeche in Mexico. Antonio el Portuguese, a Portuguese. Manuelino, Antonio el Mallorquin, he was a Filipino, and then Garcia, whoever he was. So these are names that we cannot establish were Canary Islanders. And you know, it's important to note, Canary Islanders lived here at Bayou Terre-Haute. They were not fishing and subsistence living at that point. The shores of Lake Borgne were where the criminal element lived. You had the Filipinos who were stowaways, great people, but technically, when this was a Spanish colony, they were considered criminals. The runaway slaves lived there. And there were other criminals. For instance, Antonio el Italiano married a Canary Island lady. They divorced. The divorce was decreed in New Orleans, and there is a divorce proceeding in the Cabildo which details the criminal activity of Antonio Antoni, who was called the Italian. So, you know, you're looking at rather, in my opinion, a criminal element here. Of course, there were Spanish sympathizers. I will not insult anyone's intelligence by saying that there were not people who wanted to see Louisiana return to Spain. One of them was Louis Brognier de Clouet. He wrote a memorial in 1814 about the horrors of Jacques Villeray, Bernard de Marigny, Pierre d'Avrigny, and a who's who of Louisiana. And Brognier de Clouet was an interesting man, but he definitely was one who wanted to see us become Spanish again and hoped that that would happen. Two others were Joseph de Ville Debutin de Bellechasse, who had been an officer in the Spanish militia, and Pierre Baron Boisfontaine. But what's interesting, though, is in 1817, Louis Brognier de Clouet left Louisiana, never returned. He founded the city of Cienfuegos in Cuba, and when he died in the 1840s, he was a member of the Spanish Parliament, having been decorated by King Ferdinand VII. And then conversely, Bellechasse and Baron Boisfontaine both became very successful, Belchase, I'm sorry, became very successful sugar planters in Cuba, and that's where they died. Pierre Denis de Laronde, in the Louisiana Courier of 1815, took out an advertisement wherein he praised the Canary Islanders of St. Bernard, said that it had been his pleasure and privilege to work with them, that they were honorable, and that they fought with great valor. and it was published both in French and in English, and you can see it, I think it's in May of 1815. Needless to say, after the battle, you know, there were many questions, and they were all legitimate, about why had the Villeray Canal been left open? Why had this happened? Why had that happened? And there were court-martial proceedings. So at this point, people like de Glaron began making public statements. Finally, I would like to say that it has been said also that the ancienne population, the descendants of Louisiana's colonial elite, were also spies and traitors, as were all the non-English-speaking residents of our region. Governor Jacques-Philippe Villeray eloquently expressed sentiments which best close this presentation. Quote, "Only 3 years have elapsed since the United States were yet contending against the pretended mistress of the seas for the preservation of their rights, the protection of their commerce, their honor, and perhaps their independence. During that contest, the most just which a republic ever waged against a powerful monarch, we learned to appreciate those resources which a free and generous people can ever find in their patriotism and valor against most formidable enemies. The world applauded our success and learned to respect us as a nation. The Louisianian who retraces the condition of his country under the government of kings can never cease to bless the day when the great American Confederation received him in its bosom." So I hope I haven't kept you too long, and I thank you so much. It's gotten a bit hot up here for me, but anyway, I hope you're not burning up. We have air conditioning here. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Yes, when you listed several people who were hoping to become Spanish again, was the general idea that if the British won, that we would go back to Spain?
That was definitely,
Of the illegality of
absolutely no question that many people felt that, and that definitely the British intended at some point, publicly anyway, to return Louisiana to Spanish control. Later in the weekend on Saturday, I will discuss the condition of Spain after Napoleon Bonaparte. And I don't think it would have been very easy for Spain to maintain control over Louisiana without the help of its good friend at that point, Great Britain, who did indeed liberate Spain from the clutches of Napoleon. And that was the one time that Spain really was very much allied with Great Britain, and it really benefited from Wellington and the presence of the British, and in retrospect, had Ferdinand VII, listened to Wellington and the British and preserved the Constitution of Spain and preserved the constitutional monarchy, the course of Spain might have been different. Any other questions? Yes, Paul?
I don't have any questions, but I've got an autobiography of a lady. Her name was Gould,
Right.
and
From Alabama?
from Alabama. And I may have given you a copy.
You
of
did.
that.
You did.
But she was on a balcony. I can read it to you right quick here if you like. You got it?
Sure.
It says, when the British landed on the 23rd of December, and along with the rest of the city, we were again at Mr. A.L. Duco's, D.U.N. Duncan's, and from his balcony on a corner of Royal and D'Anville Street, we saw the noble Tennessee troops that had been stationed 3 miles above, going to meet the invaders. It was always, so I can always bring it to my mind's eye those local Tennesseans as they ran down Levy Street. They had left their homes without time or opportunity to obtain uniforms and were clad in formal attire. In most uncomfortable campgrounds, disturbed. But anyway, it goes on to say they didn't even have blankets.
Oh, I know. And were it not for the people of New Orleans putting together, the ladies of New Orleans coming together, put together blankets and Band-Aids and clothing and medicine and other essentials, it would have been even worse for them.
Can I read you another paragraph here? She was on a balcony. They were on the balconies when the troops had the battle. And
Maybe how about a half a paragraph?
huh?
How about half a paragraph?
At least 4 o'clock, tidings came. My uncle sent his very intelligent mulatto servant, Hardy, to tell us our friends were safe, and we had lost only 13 killed and wounded. His messenger only increased our fears, as we could not believe, after hearing such cannon bait, that our losses were only 13 killed and wounded. So we just delivered all he said and mourned our brother and uncle and friends in our cause. Just then, our dear old friend, Dr. Flood, came up with exactly the same news, but he too failed to impress us with the truth until he became nettled at our incredibility and remarked, "Ladies, I have climbed these steps after a day's most wearisome duties to give you your tidings of our great victory. But since I have failed to give you comfort, I must bid you good evening." So I'll stop right there.
And William Flood was Andrew Jackson's surgeon in the Battle of New Orleans. And one final thing too to mention, and always remember, technically, Napoleon's sale, and I alluded to this in the remarks that I made, Napoleon's sale of Louisiana was illegal. And we were supposed to revert to Spain should the French decide once again to get rid of us. So, so that was a problem.
Right, and prior to that, in some of the things I've read, not only did Europe consider the Louisiana Purchase illegal, but in some things I've read that they also considered the Treaty of San Ildefonso illegal because it was done by force. Is that true?
No, the Treaty of San Ildefonso was not done by
It was not done by force.
the treaties that came afterward, particularly after Napoleon took the Bourbons into captivity. Can you imagine Fernando VII despised, or Prince Ferdinand, who became Ferdinand VII, despised his parents, and his mother particularly, because of her involvement with her boyfriend, Valois. And so, constantly, the family was bickering. It was scandalous. So finally, Charles IV heard and received an invitation from Napoleon to retreat to Provence in France, to a chateau, and he willingly accepted the invitation and placed himself and the royal family in captivity. Willingly. Yes.
I'm not sure if you said this now, but I heard this from someone with authority, that the boundary of New Orleans was changed over time. And the Battle of New Orleans actually took place in New Orleans.
It did.
Okay.
It did in the parish of St. Bernard did not extend upriver from Parker's Plantation until 1817. So that meant that Violet, what is today Violet, Merrill, Chalmette, and most of Arabic were all Orleans Parish.
So is that why the courthouse is down here? Is that?
Yes, it is. And the reason it moved was Dr. Merrill. Dr. Mero was the sheriff of St. Bernard Parish in the 1920s, and he was also a visionary person. He wanted to bring modern roads, he wanted to bring modern education. There were many improvements that he wanted to bring to St. Bernard, and he did. But in doing so, he became something of a despot. For example, his protege was Leander Perez. So, any other questions? Yes.
What happened to the Islenos that would help prisoners in December 23rd battle?
They lived the life of prisoners, you know, and they were in confinement, and it was not easy for them. And then, of course, when they were released, I think about the end of January, then they went to active service under the command of General Jackson. So it was
They weren't released from that until March, or was it March?
March or April.
March or April.
And by that time, they missed the planting cycle, and it was many of them just never could recuperate. Yes.
Was there any other area in the United States where the Canary Islanders settled as it did here?
Well, as I mentioned, in 1731, the Canary Islanders from Lanzarote founded San Antonio, Texas.
San Antonio.
That's still the United States, I hope.
Yes.
And then there were some Canary Islanders who went to St. Augustine, though there was a larger contingent of people from the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean.
Thank you.
Yes.
What happened with New Iberia that it became so heavily Cajun? Did they just amalgamate, or what happened?
Well, you got to remember, New Iberia is on the way west. You know, we're on the way to the Gulf. They're on the way west. And then as the Acadians came through, they intermarried extensively with the Malagueños. Same thing happened in Valenzuela. And the Canary Islanders there became rather Gallicized. You know, for example, the name Plasencia in Donaldsonville and on Bayou La Fourche, the name Plasencia was Gallicized to Plaisance. And that's just one example. So anyway, you know, but there was a great deal of intermarriage between the Acadians. The Acadians tended to be a little better healed, and they were able to read and write, some of them. I have on the table there something that you'll find interesting, maybe. Not only do I have this book of Pittman, but here I have the 1800 court proceeding of the Islenos begging, this is from the Cabildo, it's a copy of the document in the Cabildo, begging the governor to reopen the road that Bronya Diclouet had closed, because the Islenos were disturbing him when they went through the public road to reach the highway, to reach the river road rather, in order to go to the market to sell their crops. So he just had his slaves fell a 1,000-year-old apparently tree, cypress tree, and placed it in the middle of the road. So then these Islenos had to go through the back ways and through the wetland areas. There they encountered the runaway slaves, and you can see there's testimony after testimony here of the Islenos describing how the runaways attacked them, would steal their produce, or if they were coming back with money, steal their money, steal their clothing. And as you can see here, most of these Islenos signed with their ordinary mark, because we have all the heads of the households that signed the petition. This was never resolved, by the way. It shouldn't surprise you. You know, Bronya Diclouet was such an important figure in colonial Louisiana, and he had been such a friend of the elite of Spain here that they refused to take any action. Denis Laron was by this time an alcalde in the Cabildo. Hearing the case, he refused to take any action. And then the last entrance in here is Bronya Diclouet asking for relief that the Islenos had burned his fences and that they had taken over his private property and reestablished the road on his property. But to show you how these Islenos are, here they were in 1802, finding themselves in that position. In 1817, a few of them, not many, but a few of them actually followed Ronde Victory to Cuba. So you see? Thank you all so much.